Well, howdy ho there, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a little bit. It's been a little while. It has been indeed. Well, for starters, I want to do my usual rigmarole of apologizing for not uploading recently. So I'm real sorry about that. But of course, honestly, that's getting kind of fucking old at this point. Today, I finally did it. I picked up a Ryzen CPU because I was sick of my 6700K getting pretty terrible performance while live streaming, and I wanted to own something new. Honestly, I just wanted an excuse to spend money. So anyways, I picked up a Ryzen 7 1700, and of course, one of the things, like I just mentioned, that I wanted to use this chip for was for live streaming. Something that AMD, during their press event, their big press event that happened, I don't know, what was it, like a week before release, that they sort of had a little demo booth where they're showing people streaming with Ryzen versus a 7700K, I believe it was, which basically, in case you are unaware, the differences between the 6700K and the 7700K are just sort of things like a base clock increase and stuff like that, or a boost clock. I don't even remember if it's technically just the boost clock that's increased or if it's the base clock as well. I think it might be about 200 megahertz faster on the fucking base clock. So regardless, that's a tangent that's completely unnecessary for the point of this video. The point of this video is to get into some details in my past week and a half or so of testing Ryzen, using it daily for live streaming and stuff like that. And really what I was trying to do was very much push it to its limit with using a single PC streaming setup, since that is what it's sort of been pitched as to a lot of people, and that was what they were showing off at their press event. So I was of course curious to see that if it actually performs in the real world. And of course there are limitless videos talking about, benchmarking and everything around Ryzen. Although, to be entirely honest, the lack of content surrounding the 1700 is a little bit lack of content surrounding the 1700 is a little bit disappointing, if I'm honest. Really, the fact is that most people of course are shooting for that top end, their 1800X, boom boom boom. You can find tons of videos about that, and you can still find a fair few of the 1700, but of course most of the focus is on that 1800X. Now of course there's been lots of information also saying that if you overclock and have good cooling system on the 1700, you can get it to pretty much be at 1800X performance, like fucking parity. And the 1800X isn't a super great overclocker from what I've heard. Granted, I haven't tested this myself, so that, remains to be seen. I have messed with overclocking on this chip a little bit. I have only got the stock cooler, the Wraith Spire that it ships with, or well, I guess I didn't ship it. I bought it at the store, but that's just because I'm waiting on an AM4 an AM4 backplate for my cooler that I had on my 6700K, since obviously that isn't really all that common in coolers currently. I kind of wish there was an easier way to just straight up mount it to the AM4 backplate that comes on the motherboard, but nope. So basically, like I was saying, I've been using this over the past week and a half or so for streaming primarily. I haven't actually done any video editing on it yet, but that's actually what I'm going to be doing with this video that we're shooting right now. I'm going to be editing it on there, and for just a little bit of background, I've got it paired up with an Asus B350 Plus or something motherboard. It's kind of middle of the range. It was around $100 when I bought it. And one thing that very much surprised me when looking around for AM4 and boards and just the Ryzen chipset in general is, despite its popularity, most retailers have shitloads of Ryzen chips, but basically no AM4 motherboards. So I legitimately had two options, one of which only had 4 SATA ports. This is the only one that I could actually plug all of my drives into, so I went with this, and reviews were decent on it, so I was hopeful. Now of course you've probably heard lots of things like the fact that Ryzen has a lot of issues with memory compatibility, running at certain speeds and whatnot, and I was lucky enough that when I slapped this thing into my system and stuck in my DDR4 2400 megahertz that I was using on my Skylake 6700K, it worked. I mean, I've been getting some mixed signals, like certain things in Windows are saying that it's running the memory at like half the rated speed, but in the BIOS it says it's running it at full speed, so I'm not really sure what's going on there. That could be an issue with the BIOS or somehow with Windows communicating with the AM4 chipset or B350, whatever you want to call it, since obviously this is very much like infant technology. So of course it's very hard to monitor what's actually going on. In fact, most temperature readout and hardware monitoring applications don't even pick up the temperature sensors on the chip itself. So the only way to actively monitor the temperature of the chip is either through the BIOS or through Ryzen Master, which is of course AMD's software built for Ryzen. I have played with overclocking a little bit. Again, like I said, I only have the stock cooler. I was able to get it up to 3.5 gigahertz stable without messing with the voltage. It was stable for about a week of solid heavy use, and for whatever reason just today it started blue screening out of nowhere. Not sure if that has to do with my OS install or the overclock. I removed the overclock. So far things have been fine, so I've got to troubleshoot that a bit, but of course I'm just going to base it off of a lot of my tests, which were at 3.5 gigahertz on this thing when it was running perfectly stable. So one of the first things I wanted to be able to do with picking up this chip that I could not do with my 6700K was stream at 60 FPS with a slower CPU preset, so that way the limited amount of bandwidth that I can really utilize as a non-partnered streamer could be, you know, like I said, better utilized. For those of you who don't know OBS, when you choose CPU presets, there are a bunch of ones, for example, like super fast, very fast, faster, fast, slow, blah, blah, blah. All of these things basically going in a hierarchy of the fastest being the least CPU intensive, but the worst quality and the quickest encoding. So on weaker CPUs, obviously you want to obviously you want to pick a faster preset so it takes less processing time, so that way you're not pulling away as much processing power from the game that you're playing or whatever else is going on the PC at the time. Obviously, if I wasn't trying to play games on the 6700K at the same time as streaming, I could set that pretty high because all the cores could be fully utilized and dedicated to OBS, but that is not the case with the setup I'm using. So of course, like I said, I wanted to up the quality a fair bit without having to increase my bitrate dramatically due to the fact that as a non-partnered streamer, I do not have access to encoding and stuff on Twitch's end, which honestly, considering how YouTube does it, seems a little bit interesting to me, considering that YouTube is able to give encoding to everyone. I'm not 100% sure as to why Twitch can't, especially now that they're owned by Amazon, who could definitely fund that shit. But regardless, so be it. Honestly, overall fucking quality, even as a non-partnered Twitch streamer, is way better on Twitch, even though YouTube has all that encoding stuff. In order to get quality parity, I need to be streaming like a full megabit more data per second, because I'm streaming at roughly 3500 kilobits per second, so 3.5 megabits per second up on Twitch, and I get a pretty damn good looking stream, especially now with this setup. A little bit of a mess, honestly. It's because I'm just messing around with the wiring and stuff, so just please don't judge me. So of course I wanted to up the quality of my stream without dramatically increasing my bitrate. And the best way to do that is slow down, pick a slower CPU preset, and to, you know, stream at a higher frame rate as a result. So I wanted to be able to jump from just streaming 30 FPS at the very fast preset on my 6700K, which was even in some games a little bit too much for that processor, to something like somewhere in the range of the fast preset at 60 frames per second, still at 3.5 megabits per second. So of course, after setting the system up, making sure everything was working properly, reinstalling my OS, I booted up OBS, started streaming. You know, once booted up OBS, started streaming, was looking at sort of idle CPU usage, in the sense that what does it look like when I'm streaming and I'm not playing a game. And much to my surprise, like just going around web pages and stuff, so it's not updating a ton of pixels every second, there's not a ton of motion on screen, so this is not as dramatic on the CPU. So just doing these sort of idle tasks while streaming at the fast preset, 3.5 megabits per second at 60 FPS. The CPU was running at about 10-15% of, you know, fucking capacity, whatever, dude, which honestly is really, really fantastic. It seems like OBS is very much capable of utilizing all the cores and all the threads. It seemed like the load was, at least from what I could see in Task Manager, it seems like it was distributed across all 16 threads very evenly, which is of course always a fantastic thing. Now I have heard people have tried, you know, sort of manually scheduling tasks so you can dedicate like 4 cores to OBS and 4 cores to the game or whatever, but that wasn't honestly something I've been super interested in. If I can make it as hands-free as possible, that's the end goal. So of course then I decided to jump into some games, as you do when you're streaming on Twitch, and you know, just to see how things go. One thing to note when you're streaming in OBS is, despite the fact that your program might not say that you're hitting a CPU limit or anything like that, you can, if you're paying attention, especially when streaming at 60 FPS, if you got to make sure it's actually outputting 60 FPS, because what will happen is if there's sort of like a performance degradation or something that causes a lot of load to be introduced to your system, whether it be on the GPU or the CPU, and it's not up to the task, you will start not actively dropping frames, but the capture frame rate from OBS will drop significantly, and you can see that in real time on the little like counter at the bottom of OBS. So of course, you know, playing games on my 6700K, streaming at 60 FPS wasn't even like possible. If I was just idle and not streaming, it would be capturing or previewing at 60 FPS, but as soon as I started streaming, that number would dip below somewhere closer to 30 FPS, so hence why I streamed at 30 FPS on that build. Now, there is one thing to note, that Windows 10 has a lot of issues with OBS, and game capture in particular is not particularly stable on Windows 10. No idea why. Honestly, I would roll back to Windows 8, but fucking Microsoft just ended support for updating Windows 8.1 and all that shit on Ryzen and Kaby Lake. I always say fucking Kaby Lake. I don't know why. So, in order to get the most up-to-date everything on Windows, you kind of need to be on Windows 10 if you've got a newer chipset. Now, of course, I went and hopped into games, and it seems like if you use display capture, it's able to actually capture games fine. There seemed to be a little bit of, sometimes you got to tab in and out of the game a couple times for it to actually show up within display capture, if it's full screen especially. But for the most part, that seems to iron out the issues. One thing I have heard on previous version of Windows, though, is that display capture uses more processing power than game capture. Not sure why, but for now, it seems like that's the only way around the issues with game capture in Windows 10. So once I had figured that out, that took fucking ages because no one can seem to get their fucking mind made up on the internet about why fucking OBS and game capture perform so poorly. But regardless, once I had figured that out, I started to notice that, well, for one thing, frame rate dips within the actual capture frame rate were pretty much gone. The only times I saw there being an issue was with games that either I had turned their settings up way too much and the in-game frame rate would drop about 15 FPS below 60. Of course, I'm talking like I'm streaming at 720p, I'm playing the game at 1440p on a GTX 1070, and I'm trying to push the settings way further than they're supposed, like, you know, what is realistic, especially with that much load on the system. So games like Ghost Recon Wildlands, when I have those like turned way the hell up, and that game isn't particularly well optimized either. So then I would start seeing some obvious frame drops in game as well as in the capture and the output frame rate. Now, of course, if I actually have the game set up properly, it's smooth sailing, honestly. Like, the past couple days I've been streaming my playthrough of the Mass Effect Andromeda campaign, and assuming the game, which seems to be very crashy at the moment, at least on my system, assuming the game isn't crashing or locking up for whatever reason, it's actually the CPU usage when we're in your intense combat. I can't pronounce words. When you are in intense combat situations in Andromeda, as well as streaming, so there's a lot of motion going on screen, so that takes more processing power. The system leveled out at about 50-55% utilization on the processor, which to me is absolutely mind-boggling. There's so much headroom to work with that if perhaps I ever get partnered or somehow they make encoding available to everyone or something like that, I could easily up my bitrate as well and make a very high quality looking stream with very little performance impact on my end. Now, of course, it's kind of hard to benchmark this in like a video. Obviously, what's more important is to be actually testing it and doing it yourself. Obviously, there are a lot of factors that can come into play that will affect affect performance, especially with Ryzen. So things like memory speed, the board you're running on, overclocking, all sorts of stuff. Ryzen is still, again, very much in its infant stage as a technology, since, you know, it just released this month, and like fucking there are problems everywhere. I haven't really had any of them myself, for which I am very thankful for, but it seems like this Ryzen really could be making a big difference. Now, of course, I just wanted to address some of the things said on my previous Ryzen video, not the response video, the original one. There are a lot of people commenting on that video saying, better delete this video, Ryzen's the next big disappointment. If that disappoints you, dude, I don't know what future technology you're running on, because this is sure as hell not disappointing. Yeah, sure, maybe benchmarks for like fucking playing games at 1080p, they're not great. But you know what? If you bought an 8-core 16-threaded chip for solely gaming, you are not a smart fellow. Now, of course, when I used to really only make YouTube videos, I didn't stream at all. I had a quad-core 8-threaded i7, and that was fantastic and more than ample. But for heavy multitasking, where you're trying to not only, you know, like if I'm editing video on that thing, I was typically just rendering it and maybe watching a YouTube video while it rendered or something like that. That is not heavy multitasking in the truest sense of the word. Live streaming is very much multitasking in the truest sense of the word, where you have two processes running at the same time that can be very taxing and need to be evenly distributed across a bunch of cores to do a lot of calculations, computations, and so the fact is that this chip, as much as it might have fallen short on some areas in terms of, you know, just gaming at 1080p, it definitely lives up to those promises that AMD has, you know, put forth for the chipset. And I'm honestly super excited to see where Ryzen 5 and Ryzen 3 go, even though obviously that's not really my kind of thing. I can definitely see the Ryzen 5 chips especially just completely killing the i7, like the 4-core 8-thread i7s, and making those price drops. Like Intel's gonna have to lower the prices even more, because honestly, if those 4-core 8-thread chips are at all overclockable, you could get them very easily within the range of current i7s from Intel, like maybe not up to like 5 gigahertz, probably pretty close, maybe like Skylake level overclocks, like maybe 4.5 gigahertz, around that range. I could see that very much introducing a lot of really good competition. I'm very interested to see what AMD does with the Ryzen chipset. I have a feeling that next year they're going to release some like refresh or whatever, perhaps fixing a lot of the issues that exist with this, maybe increasing clock speeds. I doubt there's going to be a ton of stuff other than that, since, you know, obviously it's a new chipset. They already made a massive leap forward with this from their previous architecture being, was it Bulldozer? I don't know what their code names are, but I'm talking about the FX chips. It's a huge jump forward from that, and honestly, I'm super excited to see where this goes, and I'm very, very pleased with my fucking purchase. Honestly, I was not expecting the kind of performance that I've gotten. Anyways, guys, I know that was probably a pretty long-winded video, so hopefully you guys enjoyed that. If you managed to stick around, or you are new here or whatever, and you enjoyed what you saw, would you please slap a like on it? And of course, if you're new here, if you could just if you want to see more, you just go down there. Go down there and click the like button. Yes, or not the like button, the subscribe button. I mean, click the like button too. Honestly, that's perfectly fine. I'm not gonna say don't do that. Anyways, guys, thanks again for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed, and I'll see you around. Home slice.